Carl, getting you on this podcast talk just because the weather is changing, and I don't know what it's like, in your area of the country, but in Vancouver, it seemed like somebody flipped a switch and it's colder. So I did a run yesterday, did my tempo run, and I'm like, oh, geez, the muscles are a little tighter. And then I go up to the park and there's like people with dogs throwing tennis balls. I almost got wiped out by a couple of dogs. I'm like, this sucks. Um, so I wrote a letter to the city. But what I wanted to talk about was, we're looking at alternatives for when the weather does get poor and it gets cold and wet and snowy. And, if the hurricane is showing up, what are the alternatives? And there's so many different things right now. There's obviously your conventional treadmills. I wrote an article piece on the curved manual treadmills, which I thought were kind of cool. I kind of liked them. There's some differences there amongst the different brands. There's, incline treadmills. There's, I think somebody sent me a friend of mine that I just talked to sent me this, is it a Stairmaster kind of incline treadmill? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Stairmaster has a campaign right now where the sled is dead. So they have a combination of some sort of advanced model where you can do farmer's walks on it. So there's actually a way to lift it up like a wheelbarrow, and there's plates on it, and they have kind of like an accelerative type posture that you can be put in there, and you can do. It's sort of like the Techno Gym product too. So they're not interested in obviously walking or running straight. There's the lateral shuffles that you can do, and so Stairmaster even has like a hit campaign. It's not just that. There's boxing stations and all these other products that are being promoted because the sprinting or the maximal effort type modalities are now the new normal. There's just an article just now on express style lifting where it's 13 minutes of high intensity training on the lifting side is now in vogue. So obviously the energy system development products that are that whole market space is now catering towards that.
Yeah. And I tried locally, I tried the high trainer. They sent me a nice shirt, and it's an acceleration based manual treadmill where you lean into it and you get some metrics, and that's different. It's cool. I'm an acceleration guy. Great. But I find it's getting very, very specific. You don't have sort of these general multi-purpose tools. You have these very specific pieces of technology now where, either that's the mode you're going to use, or the gym has to invest in, a lot of different types of products to fulfill all of these needs, these niche needs. What do you think of that? Do you think that's good if you're, spending a good amount of money on a piece of equipment and it's just a very specific, like you said, maybe it's a specific energy system that or specific muscle groups that you're attacking?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I'll be in the middle, which is the most controversial part to be is just seeing the pros and cons to everything. I like the idea that there's been a lot of progress, that there is a product such as the Ultra G that's out there that's specialized and has a specific role. Unfortunately, the fact that we have it shows the signs that we're not really cracking the code. We're kind of still dealing with the same injuries, but with better reactive type tools to deal with either post-surgical unloading and things like that. We're seeing a rise in the curved treadmill where now there's a dozen models.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing kind of like the ultra thin options, which is not just consumer based, but we forget that this is over 100 years old, this technology. Nothing's really changed except there's like an iPad or a tablet with the measurements. So instrumentation type treadmills are leaving the research realm and becoming the new kind of high level prosumer type market. Obviously with as the high trainer, I see that there's a lot of discussion on that product because it's unique because you are accelerating. One of the biggest weaknesses of treadmills is that they've always been an endurance product, or they've been in an interval running product. So you do a 30-second type fast run, or there's been the overspeed, 10, 15 years ago, where, every single kid that's 14 years old is apparently running at 27 miles per hour. So that's kind of the market as a whole, where that's kind of where we're seeing, the whole spectrum of products. The question is, are people aware of the intricacies?
Yeah, I don't know. I think again, it just boils down to like, oh, I had a good workout, or it looked cool. Like it seems like a lot of these companies are also tethering people on these treadmills too. Like, oh, we're gonna put a belt around you and tie it to the back of the treadmill, and you're gonna get some resistance there. And I see some of the mechanics that come out of that, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I like
Well,
that. So
yeah. So there's that becomes the big discussion point, which is, can we trust the kinetics and kinematics of a treadmill? And yeah, it's very similar. Let's be honest. There's not like this dramatic change with kind of conventional high speed treadmills that are high quality. I think what gets people confused is when they see someone doing apparently like a 8-second sprint, and they're permanently leaning in a 20 degrees forward with a tether artificially. And if you just don't maintain that. And that's one of the things with acceleration and maximum velocity, is that there is this gradual rise of your posture. If you're just sprinting for a short burst of 8 seconds, well, that's about 70 to 80 meters on a track. What's the way that you run it? It's usually this kind of gradual rise. So that becomes confusing to when you have these sensors on the back of the body to try to get horizontal forces through a load cell. It's a little bit iffy, because you're seeing data that just does not match with normal strides. We can see that with our own eyes, and then you can see, even with a smartphone, that the video doesn't look good. And when you start seeing athletes uncomfortable on the equipment, because it is kind of strange to go sprint all out, do people kind of guard a little bit? So you might not see huge changes visibly, but you see a lot of times an athlete will have a little bit of a different stride parameter, and that small change might not be ideal. You might see some, EMG readings that are just enough at the threshold to say, is this worth doing? I think there's a big difference between doing a tempo running sessions when you're dealing with either snow or 110 degrees outside in the summer. There's a difference. I think people need to talk about that. Like, for example, you were talking about the stiffness of curved treadmills and augmenting the reductions and the adaptations with plyos. Maybe you could get into that.
yeah, I just know, like, one of the things that I liked about the curved treadmills is I didn't have the same impact as I would say running on a, flat ground, or especially if I was, if I had to run on asphalt or concrete. So, okay, this is now a reasonable alternative. But of course, because of the curved profile, you land on it, you're probably on the ground a lot longer because it's dispersing the force over that curve and over your ground contact. And so that's the trade-off. And I had some people comment that when they did go and run on level ground after, once I guess they did a whole season indoors on these curved treadmills, and then when they went outside, they started to feel, some soreness around the ankle joint and in different parts of their lower leg that they had never experienced. So, it is similar enough in many respects, but that ground contact issue is different enough to create soreness. And so they're not prepared. So maybe there is something. I do a lot of the mock drills, for vertical force production. I do a lot of little smaller plyos and ankle jumps all the time. So I thought, okay, why don't we combine those activities, because you can still do it in your small facility space, use the curved treadmill.
Yeah.
And you do have to kind of hybridize these things so that you can get the best sort of the best possible effect, in lieu of not being able to run outside properly.
Yeah, and that's kind of the big debate with practitioners are these short burst acceleration options, right, for conditioning. Because if you were to condition NFL linemen, you're probably going to have short bursts of activity, if you're to be quote specific, but you're not going to have them do a 30-minute run, right? Even if you use a, alter G for, and just remove whatever percentage of body weight so that they can make a continuous run to get conditioning, is that really specific? And there's the biomechanical aspects. Is it going to get a good transfer? So when they're playing actual games, are they transitioning properly? Another thing is concussion protocols. Do you use a bike? Do you use a manual treadmill, whether it's curved or it's accelerative or incline? I think that's going to be, a big discussion point, because you eventually have to buy something. And believe it or not, ellipticals and stationary bikes and all these kind of machine-based aerobic type activities, a lot of the athletes like it that are veterans, because they can just train the heart and lungs and rest the muscles and joints. So we're seeing a lot of kind of acceptance of sort of the fitness type training, because it isn't specific to the sport. It's very complementary.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Alter G, and I couldn't help but think about the Vomit Comet Usain Bolt video clips that are going out. Did you see that one where he's in the weightless plane or whatever, and they show him running? Yeah, and I'm like, oh, that looks way different.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Is the the foreign, anything that's artificial could be good or it could be a problem, and that's up to the resultant of the combination of whatever you're doing on the field or on the track, and then time will tell. I am a guy that doesn't like to put all my eggs into one basket, because I think that's just not a very safe way to do things. To diversify is probably a kind of a shrewder way of managing risk. It's just that what we see is, like, for example, there's been a lot of athletes that had a lot of problems with when they do high intensity cycling routines, is because they go through and do that. Now they're having the same specific overuse syndromes as a cyclist, so like, anything that, like runner's knee, swimmer's shoulder, you've seen the great ones. A guy like Alberto Salazar had swimmer's shoulder, because when he had an issue, when he was injured, he hopped in the pool, and what did he do? He trained really heavy in the pool and did freestyle excessively. So I think those are the things that people have to think about. Is it's not just the different types of treadmill options, it's how they fit within a program. And a lot of times the instructions are always going to come from the companies who come up with these guides, and they're always centric around their own product, because it's like the Forrest Gump movie, where it's, gumbo shrimp cocktail, Cajun shrimp. It's always about what their product is doing. So there's an overdose versus how does it fit within a program. And I think that's what concerns me the most, is that where are you going to get the information from regarding protocols on any of this stuff?
Yeah, and it seems like that's a very good point, because it seems like when I get queried about these devices, and I'm sure you get the same kind of questions, it's I need it because I only have this much space. So space is usually a constraint. So I just need one of them, and I'm going to stick it here. For that's for professional teams. A lot of the time it's space. I have room for one. What should I get? And then the other part of it was for maybe a private owner or operator of a facility, it's cost. So the budget issue becomes very present for a lot of these private owners, and going, well, I'd like to get at least one of them, so it looks like we have one and people can try it, but I can't get 5 of them. Maybe I could get 5 stationary bikes for the price of a treadmill. So a lot of this calculation is going on in the consumer's mind. I think it's not just how does it fit into a program. It's more like, I kind of want one. How do I make it work?
Yeah, and that's very complicated, because if you go to a modern facility in pro sports, it's kind of an arms race. It's a Cold War. How many X do you have? Or, if you go on and see vibration platforms and look online there's 10 of them, and I'm doing the math of what the cost was. That's a lot of money. And so when you're dealing with teams and you have, like, for example, a football team, you can't have one treadmill. Now, if that is, it's going to have to be a testing device. Maybe it's there for, you're recruiting athletes, and they see all this stuff in there. A lot of the stuff is not enterprise designed. It's there to say, okay, we have it. It's there. We kind of use it, but unless it's like a squat rack where everyone has access to it, or you share it in a reasonable fashion, it's kind of a mystery. So that's why sports medicine, they always have like one of each modality, because it's sort of like a holding pattern. But for conditioning, most people are dealing with probably the field to get the job done, or if you're doing a recovery day, or a moderate sized pool.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is reactionary, because I've been at teams facilities or college, well, mostly pro teams, where you say, oh, why do you have that? Oh, this guy really likes it, right? Or he used it before, so he really likes it, so we got one. And then sometimes I've heard, oh, so-and-so in the front office really likes this, so that's why we bought it. So very rarely is it a proactive strategy of like, okay, this is how we're going to create our facility, and these are the options we want. It's like, oh, they wanted one. Oh, that looked cool. I was at the conference and that looked kind of cool. So more thought has to go into the big picture, obviously.
Yeah, and the other thing is the next step is, obviously, when you're having a treadmill or any of this technology that's out there for conditioning, the Jacob's ladder was 10 years the big thing. And there's different, on the conditioning side, it's amazing. You think they would be running out of ideas, but they always got to hand it to those businesses. They really find creative ways to say, here's the next gen. For example, like Peloton. An indoor bike, I'm shocked. It's like, I'm still waiting to see not only the stuff evolve, but the user experience at home. People are expecting 3 times as much in the pro sports side, because there is, unfortunately, a wow factor, an entertainment factor. Now, you can say all you want.
Yeah. When does VR, virtual reality, come into it, where they slap this on and then you're on the bike or you're on the treadmill? When does that happen?
Yeah, it's already started. There's some issues already going on that not only you're seeing with just the actual physical side of the device and the hardware, but now there's a perceptual issue. When you start messing around with VR and it's not done well, if you're spending a lot of time on that, we're not making Fortnite jokes here, but if you're spending most of your time in VR and VR is not done properly, now whatever you're exposed to is, you're kind of stuck with those type of experiences. So I understand, like, when you're watching film that's not technically preparing for the game physically, but obviously you're just recognizing patterns. So it's really useful for the athlete to connect. We're seeing some really bizarre hybrids where you're doing aerobic conditioning and that's stimulating the brain. And then there's point of view experiences of the player, but it has nothing to do with the game. So, like, for example, Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers stepping back in the game, why would he be walking on the system for 30 seconds and seeing the same play over and over again? It's bizarre. So there's a lot of attempts now to add the wow factor. Either conventional tablet, there's always been the biofeedback of your heart rate or the level or intensity. That's kind of the standard, the basic. But now you're starting to get sort of this near VR experience where you're getting an oversized tablet or flat screen, and now you're cycling in France, or you're running through the trails of Oregon. I don't know. I think there's a little bit too much of that, because why not just drop them out in the forest and just get some fresh air? But like what we saw earlier with out in Vancouver, that sometimes fresh air isn't really fresh. So we got to be careful.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about, you know, uh, we're looking at sort of the high end a lot of the time for pro sports. And I think a lot of the manufacturers go, okay, that's what I'm building for. But then if you look at the affordability and the, sort of the economies of scale of maybe the fitness facility versus the smaller facility versus the home user, I think it gets really complicated to know what to target and where to, because obviously the top manufacturers want to serve all of those people. But is it useful for startups to focus on, pro sports, maybe to get because it's the NFL Combine. I'm looking at all these products that were set up at the trade show, and I'm like, oh, geez, that's pretty high end. And you're just going to market it to 32 teams.
Yeah. So let's discuss that, because right now I want pro teams, college teams, and even the high schools to realize that, when you see a company that is really high end like that, you can't have if it's a mom and pop operation and there's 5 to 12 employees, maybe there's a big enough market on that elite level internationally to support that. Altitude chambers, talk about a specific area. Well, now they're in the recreational level, and they're now entering the kind of like the fitness level, where you can go and do like a spinning class at at the heights of Denver. So I think we have to be careful when we look at all this equipment, regardless if it's any type of conditioning product, down to anything that's delivering any type of barbell velocity or monitoring. Who are they serving, and do they really care about the elite sport market? The biggest hint to that is how they're being funded and what is the expectations. Because usually a lot of these companies are looking to slap a couple team logos, on their website, so they can get the trust of the investors to say, let's do another round. So if you can trust us with the pro sports and you get a couple military contracts, then what do? They have the healthcare, the senior care, and all those other models. If you're buying from anyone, make sure you tell that the person that you're doing the sales with is like, if you're catering to us, we want to see a commitment, and that means development. Otherwise, it's likely that they're just trying to get a little bit of Forbes or a little bit of Wall Street Journal, kind of publicity, and then try to trickle down to the prosumer. Because the recreational, the spinning classes and all the other stuff, that pays the bills. The fitness level, the wellness, elite sport, you're using as glorified marketing, unless it's a company that is dedicated and has a history of 5 to 10 years of only being in the pro sport space. Then we know they're committed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just, interested to see where the technology goes moving forward. If you had to advise one of these companies, what would be the, maybe 3 things that you'd tell them to focus on?
Well, that's a good one. You pop quiz. So let's start with the obvious. Build for the user, don't build for the investor. So a lot of companies are always asking, okay, how do we branch out or whatever? If you're using the initial market as a springboard, that's okay. I mean, if you're trying to do something really hard, a lot of great things have happened from NASA, where someone invents a microwave, or there's a lot of inventions. If you ever fly into Boston, they have a nice JFK tribute of how NASA has helped us make things that for everyday life better. So there's nothing wrong with elite sport, because that's how you make the average knee replacement better is when you start to look at some of these very difficult situations. So the first thing I always just say is you got to make sure you build and put all in to the person you're supporting initially. Otherwise, you kind of half finish the job so that you can move on to senior care because it's $1 billion industry versus, like you said, 32 teams. The second thing is, what's your vision? It's really disturbing is that people are always chasing features or they're trying to impress people with deep analytics. The University of Florida strength coach said it best. Coach Matt said, I get just kind of curious about these algorithms when you're measuring subpar training. So you see these companies will go to the local gyms and start getting all this data from really bad training or bad training information. So the machine learning or the artificial intelligence is, taking all of those, strides or whatever is being measured, and now they're creating algorithms. And like they say on the, garbage in and garbage out. I forget who said that, but that was a good point. I heard that on social media is like, anytime you have some of these modelings, if you're not modeling based upon a vision and you're modeling based upon a bottom up, that's dangerous. So always make sure that the vision is from an expert or someone that's in the field versus a business owner or CEO or a venture capitalist. They'll always have a vision based upon making money, which is important. This is a business that needs to function, but you really want to make it on actually solving a problem. And the last one is not necessarily listening to your, always do, getting bugs and listening to your customers, but it's knowing when the customer is not able to know what they're doing wrong. And here's an example of that. A lot of times a coach might not be familiar with what the goal or the intention of the sports science is. So they're chasing product buzz components versus the actual soul of what the purpose of the product is. You said this a couple times earlier, and an example would be velocity-based training, where 10, 15 years ago, you saw a lot of people doing really fast upright rows with light weights with no leg drive because they were chasing a number. So I think it's important that that these companies, they focus on listening to the coaches that understand the science, and then make sure the sports scientists understand the realities of working in the wild, where it doesn't matter how great the instrumentation is. Is it simple to use? Is it convenient? Is it the user experience is good? So I think there's a combination of a trade-off where you have to listen, but don't listen to too much, because if they're new to this, that means they didn't understand and have the need yet. So, and I think that's kind of that. Those three things are probably the most important.
That's some great points. So I, again, look forward to seeing what comes around the corner here with some of these technologies, what lasts the test of time. And, I'm also even just interested in like, I was watching some video of CrossFit, and they're incorporating pieces of equipment, treadmills, the ski, whatever erg thing. And so, people want those pieces of equipment because it's incorporated into that competition environment. So it's interesting,
It is interesting. And I think the future is going to be somewhere where there's going to be a contraction to the market, and there's going to be also an expansion where I think really the nimble, agile companies that have the vision are going to do really well, and people that are chasing trends, you can see that with, we saw that with heart rate monitors 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then you see now everything, like the Apple Watch came out, and they just have a new way to get your heart rate from the wrist. But if you ask the average person how they use a heart rate monitor, there hasn't been much evolution in the last 15, 20 years. So I think what we're going to see with the technology side is people are going to be a little bit more selective because, people are unplugging. So I think we're going to see some expansion of some new ideas, recycling of old ideas like medical products being repurposed as recovery devices. And we're also going to see some innovation where some of the smarter startups are going to understand that you got to use your own equipment. And if you're not using your own equipment, then the chances of them being successful down the road is very slim to none. So that's why I always ask how to use the equipment. And if you're building it for others, it's not a good idea. The last thing I want people to think about is they had a conference where they asked people to raise the hand and said, do you like the idea of what you're making for the mass market? Meaning, if you're a company that's making some of these software solutions or hardware solutions, are you comfortable having those products being used on yourselves? And the response was people didn't like what they were making because they were kind of spooked about this Big Brother side. So I think that's kind of the sign of times as well, is that, if you use the product that you're making and you believe in it and it's a tool for you, that's great. If you're just making it, and it's very synthetic and very sterile, and you're just making it because you think there's a business to be said, I don't think that's a wise idea. So those are my parting thoughts, Derek. And you had some great questions.
Great. Thanks once again for your thoughts, and we'll touch base very soon for an update.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate it.